important, the leader of our country, the finance minister of our country, Arun ji, please.
Shri Rana Kapoor, the President of the ASSOCHAM, leaders of the industry, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the very outset thank Mr. Kapoor and his team for having invited me to speak at the annual event of the ASSOCHAM, where you are reaffirming your belief and confidence in India and its ability to be amongst the global leaders in the world. I'm conscious of the fact that under the somewhat prolonged and continuing leadership of Mr. Kapoor, there is a lot of energy that ASSOCHAM has shown in the last few years. With a lot of competitiveness amongst the various chambers itself, to make your presence felt in that large crowd, one has to endeavor. And by the consistent display of that continuous energy, bringing out documents, reports, think tank activities, working ahead of others, thinking ahead of others, I must say that the recognition and identification of ASSOCHAM as a prominent leader of the industry has itself been reaffirmed. And it is no mean achievement that to keep a positive environment going, particularly when the global trends are never very exciting. If we look at what is happening in the world, continuously, periodically, the IMF starts revising the global growth estimates downwards. I've repeatedly been saying that earlier management of the economy was somewhat simpler because you had an occasional crisis in a decade or more. But today you live in a world which is full of turmoil, which is full of volatility. And you have to think ahead of the others because you are continuously busy drowsing the impact of one fire and trying to put firewalls around your own economy that you can be saved from those crises. I do believe that the new global norm is volatility and turmoil. It is no longer stability. And things can change very fast. 2 years ago, the economist wrote that the eye had a danger of being thrown out of the bricks. And today, the other emerging markets, which are a part of the BRICS, be it Brazil, be it Russia, are facing very serious challenges. China is too large and a powerful an economy, but has its own challenges. And if you see occasional green shoots or signs of recovery, at times that proves to be patchy, and then it is overtaken by certain geopolitical factors which create global instability. What the ISIS has been doing in the last few months across the world itself poses a new danger to civilization. And therefore, its impact on global economies cannot be understated. Buoyancy in currencies, in trade, its adverse impact on tourism, all these are going to be consequential factors. And global resources, which are earlier intended to be spent on poverty eradication and meeting the challenges of development, will now be increasingly diverted towards security measures. And which part of the world is safe itself will become a great question. Under these circumstances, what does an economy like India do? India has special features. Its strengths are that it houses 1/6 of the global population. There's a very large or a huge sense of entrepreneurship in India. There is a newborn confidence that India and Indians have. And this is at times reflected by the entrepreneurial and the extrovertish character of India. Then now when you see Indian leaders, particularly the Prime Minister, traveling internationally, the extension of India through its diaspora is more visible today. We have a large population, trained human minds who go and adopt any society in the world, remain Indians at heart, and remain connected with this country. And therefore, the strength of this country and its people is being felt both within and outside. And it has to be our endeavor that even in a world of adversity today, India carves out its own place. Can we insulate ourselves entirely from the global trends? The answer is no, we can't. But even if we can't insulate ourselves from the global trends, we are globally integrated, the impacts will be felt. How do we minimize the impact in adversity? And how do we take an advantage out of the emerging global situation? History presents us with this challenge. Those in India who stall reforms must simply realize that India of 2015 is not the India of 1971. The place for obsolete thinking and that space in India is now shrinking. India has become increasingly aspirational. It's not merely your middle class. It's those aspiring members of those aspirational classes who are aspiring to get into the middle classes and even higher. They also believe that they can find their place under the sun. And that constituency today, which is aspirational, which supports growth, which supports reforms, is inherently much bigger than those who obstruct it. And therefore, this is a great challenging moment where, on account of contradictions either in our policy or in our politics, we can neither allow the current generation or the future generation to suffer on that count. China has slowed down, but it still shoulders a very large part of the global growth. The world markets have shrunk. Therefore, the export sectors globally are suffering. In India's case, it is substantially values and partly volumes which are impacted on exports. So the global slowdown does impact on us. Those who buy from us, their capacity to buy is now limited. Additionally, if the price of refined oil, India's export basket is 18% refined oil. And therefore, if the oil prices are down to half, commodity prices are down, metal prices are down, there will be a shrinkage both in the export and the import market. So that is one adverse impact that we have. Currency battles across the world will also have an impact both on our markets and our currencies. How do we then not merely showcase, but effectively grow India into an economy where global investors feel that this is a place which is safe for me to invest? Investors are not philanthropists. They don't come for charity. They see the best destination, and in that best destination, they target the maximum that they can get out of those destinations. And therefore, we in India must seriously realize that globally the investors are looking forward to us. We are getting more investment than any other country in the world. And therefore, we must seize this opportunity, cut the corners wherever they exist, so that we can not merely take baby steps, but cumulatively take a large number of significant steps which bring about structural changes as far as the Indian economy is concerned. We must be aware of the adversities. I explained one adversity is the current geopolitical situation. The next adversity is the shrinking global market. There is a third also, that whereas public investment has increased, foreign direct investment has increased, the pace of private investment has still to pick up. India's private sector had probably overstretched itself, and therefore it must utilize its expanded capacities as demands grow in order to make sure that the private sector, which normally in good circumstances leads the government, also performs its obligation in not merely expanding their own businesses, but the larger obligations that they owe to the country. Governance is not an easy proposition. And administering the Ministry of Finance is no easy job. 18 months ago, we virtually inherited a sub 5% economy, where let alone international investors, the domestic investors were also moving out. We had a task of re-establishing the credibility of the Indian economy. And then suddenly, the first few months went into that exercise. I found myself, thanks to the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, with 10% lesser resources. And as I look down the tunnel, I look at the pressures in the next year of sticking to my fiscal discipline, satisfying all those who wanted the OROP, additionally looking at the burden created by the 7th Pay Commission, undertaking the large commitments which we have taken with regard to infrastructure and irrigation, and continuing to invest in India's social sector so that our most prized resource, the people themselves, can develop. How do we now convert all these challenges into an opportunity? And I think to do that, one has to realize that when in doubt, you must think straight and go straight. Investment is the starting point. If investments dry up, economic activity dries up and growth dries up. And therefore, we had a challenge that public investment must increase, which is something which we have endeavored to do. Private investment must be incentivized. And our doors and processes must be made simpler for foreign investment to come in. We are undertaking all the three exercises. And as resources come in, we can expect cheaper finance, we can expect larger economic activity, more job creation, more revenues. And therefore, if we are able to touch a reasonable growth rate, which is an essential requirement, with growth rate, the revenues will increase. Not only does the GDP increase, the notional GDP increases. That is directly linked to my revenues. And with higher growth rate and more revenues, to absorb the financial burden of either the OROP or the Pay Commission, or to undertake additional exercises, is reasonably possible, provided we continue to grow. And therefore, whether it is poverty to be eradicated, jobs to be created, higher revenues to absorb these additional burdens, because of a lot of what goes to the employees, and I never grudge the employees for that, in another sense comes back into the system. Through their taxes, through their savings, through their expenditure. And therefore, India has to grow. And what is the roadmap to growth? The structural reforms have all to be undertaken. Slowly but surely, one after the other, we have to move in that direction. So having opened up the investment, you have to ease in business systems. And the best evidence of ease is when captains of the industry stop coming to North Block. And I think that's one of the high points of the Indian economy today. Whether it's your problems with taxation or with FIPB or with the environment or with local governments, when things start happening on their own, business systems are easing up. But we can at best claim that even though our positions are moving up, they'll probably move up more next year, this is still work in progress. We have to make sure that the spectrum story or the coal block allocation story, which brought scars of corruption and a lot of stigma to the system, are not repeated in India ever again. And therefore, government discretions of all kinds in these matters have to be completely eliminated. That's the direction in which we are moving. Having done that, you need empowering of the states. And therefore, even though 10% more goes to the states as a result of the 14th Finance Commission, I said I don't grudge them for it. The states obviously have a shared sovereignty with the center. They've also been elected, and therefore they are also going to spend in larger popular welfare. And it's extremely important that the states are empowered. One good impact that this has had is that state after state is now competing with each other to attract investment. Even erstwhile states which were not so progressive have at least the idiom, the language, and some of the policies also have changed in their cases. Hopefully, this will also make decision-making both in center and states much faster. Rationalization of subsidies, and therefore, if you have to absorb this entire expenditure, you earn more through larger growth. You also curtail wasteful expenditure. And in fact, that rationalization in the last several months, either through the DBT programs or through linking some expenses with the market, has been one of the most important unsung reforms of India. It's enabled us to take the shock of both depletion of resources as also larger outgoes which are going out. And this has certainly helped us. But there are still some challenges in certain sectors. Banking is a challenge. I do not know what my predecessors were doing when this state of affairs was being brought to the Indian banking system. No growing economy can survive with the impaired assets of this value. And therefore, not only have the banks to be recapitalized, you also need to address the issues of each of those sectors. The steel industry has to be protected from an unfair surge. The highways have now got moving. The EPC contractors who found themselves virtually paralyzed through the two ordinances, particularly the Arbitration Act, we've now created a system for resolution within 6 months through a single member arbitrator with very little scope for challenge. The DISCOMs were like a highway which leads to a state highway and then finally leads to a kacha road, and therefore it leads to a complete clogging of the traffic. So the bad health of the DISCOMs now gets reflected in the generation companies. It gets generated in the distribution companies. And DISCOMs can't survive merely by taking loans from banks, because somebody has to pay the banks back. There is no free lunch. And some of the DISCOMs are almost on the verge of collapse. And therefore, the package, the Uday scheme, which has been announced 2 weeks ago, in order to reform the sick DISCOMs, take the debt off, at least the interest burden, will reduce the power costs, gradually move up the tariffs so that people start paying for the power that they consume, and DISCOMs start paying and buying power and paying for it. But the states will have to take the hit as far as those DISCOMs are concerned. So these are each of the sectors which are being addressed. A lot of savings which have come out of the system, therefore, have led to larger infrastructural spending. But some important aspects of this activity still remain work in progress. Both our direct and indirect tax system need to be reformed. First, a word on the indirect tax system. The wisdom which has dawned on my friends in the Congress party had not dawned on them when Shri Pranab Mukherjee introduced the GST. It did not dawn on them when Mr. Chidambaram accepted the standing committee recommendations. But to come out with a preposterous suggestion that a tariff must be mentioned in the constitution document, so that in a given exigency, if tariffs need to be altered, you need a two-third majority in both houses of parliament and then have to go to each of the states. It would be better, it would be extremely unfair to the country if we tried to impose on, in the name of a political compromise, a GST with a defective architecture. And where tariff rates are to be mentioned in the constitution itself is a flawed architecture. It wasn't there in Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's bill, it wasn't there in Mr. Chidambaram's bill. And therefore, the effort of any government, governments are elected for the people, or any parliament or any assembly, is to charge tax at a rate which is the bare minimum amount required. I now find another objection, which was unanimously agreed upon by the standing committee and accepted by the UPA government, that if there are some disputes, how are disputes with regard to tax fixation to be reformed? The first issue was that there will be a GST council. The center will have a one-third vote. The states will collectively have a two-third vote. And to enable them to work together, you will require a three-fourth majority to take a decision. That is the architecture which the standing committee suggested. That's the architecture which has been accepted by all the states. Now, two suggestions have emerged. The first is, make the center 1/4. And if the center becomes 1/4, effectively states with a 3/4 mandate alone decide India's taxation policy. So India, that is a union of states, the union ceases to exist. Even before raising these suggestions, somebody has to seriously ponder over these issues. The government of India, by accepting such suggestions in a flawed structure, can't become a stranger to India's taxation policy. And if there is a dispute by a 3/4 majority, the GST Council decides. The suggestion is, no, create a forum with a judge heading it who will decide. Now in India, the separation of powers between the executive, legislature and the judiciary was one of our basic features. It's already been diluted with a large part of legislative or executive power moving away. I need not go into details. Taxation is one of the very few powers that Parliament has. That in the world's biggest democracy, the power of taxation must also go to the courts. A party having ruled India for almost over 50 years, to make a suggestion of this kind, I think they'll probably have to revisit some of these suggestions. I have no difficulty in discussing with them, but the suggestions must never lead to a GST with a flawed architecture. Because a GST with a flawed architecture can actually damage the system much more than it can benefit. And once we are going in for such reforms, these reforms take place once in decades. And I would expect a party which for over half a century has been a ruling party in this country, to seriously reconsider some of these suggestions. We are reaching out to them, we are willing to discuss with them, because some of these suggestions may not necessarily be in the larger interest of the GST structure itself. I had in the budget announced a major direct tax reform, where I had said we'll simplify taxation. Some of the exemptions, except the savings encouraging exemptions, can be phased out. We have already notified the first lot. Obviously, when you bring down the tax rate from 33% down to 25%, some exemptions will have to go. And too many of these exemptions eventually make the tax policy of India a rent-seeking exercise. This cannot continue indefinitely in an economy which aspires to be a global leader. And therefore, simplification of tax, bringing the direct tax rate down to global levels, reducing the rates, having only essential exemptions in place is a roadmap which I had laid down, and I would like chambers like yours to seriously consider some of these suggestions. We have a long roadmap ahead of us. And in this roadmap, you already have the draft bankruptcy code, which is an important reform measure which has been put on the net. Please give your suggestions to the same. We therefore also have some important ordinances, including the Dr. Vijay Kelkar Committee on PPPs has made some very valuable suggestions, which we are examining them. The commercial courts law and the arbitration law for early disposal of all commercial disputes are all a part of the agenda to make business activity easier, which we probably will try and introduce some of these legislations in the coming session of Parliament itself. If despite all these challenges, we are growing by the rate of 7% to 8%, what is it that we need for the extra growth? You need to continue with this process of structural reforms. You need to rationalize taxations. You need the GST. You need more investment. You need to put more money into infrastructure, more money into irrigation, because these are sectors. Infrastructure at least takes some reasonable time before bringing back the results. Irrigation brings back immediate results. And therefore, our challenge is, can we take all these steps and get that cutting edge which is needed to bring us that extra 1 to 2% over our current rates? And that in a globally adverse environment where the winds are not exactly helpful. So if the global winds become more helpful, we are able to continue with these reforms, increase the level of private sector investment. Our ambition to increase our growth rates by an extra 1 or 2% will then appear to be modest. And I think India has very challenges, but then we love our democracy, we love our leadership, and therefore we need a lot of support in order to make sure that some of these very logical steps, hurdles are created in them. And if we are able to do that, I see India's journey and destination evolve, challenging, but not very difficult. Thank you very much for support and for having me.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for that comprehensive address. May I request you now and the other distinguished dignitaries to kindly release the ASSOCHAM publication, Winds of Change. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very, very significant publication from ASSOCHAM, and this special publication features the Chamber's achievements since 2013 under the aegis of President Shri Rana Kapoor. The Honourable Minister and distinguished dignitaries on the dais now releasing the same.
Well, sir, I see on the ground there is a sense of optimism regardless what the media says. But then the question is, why the general mood in the country is still not coming forward to make investment? And I would call it stock exchange normally is a good barometer of confidence. And I do believe, sir, that a time has come, which reminds me when Mr. I.K. Gujral was the Prime Minister and Mr. Chidambaram was his Finance Minister, he called for 4 hours meeting, we all attended, and the idea was how to kick-start the movement. And I do feel that that kind of thing is needed at the level where Prime Minister sat for 3 hours out of that. A lot of decision came. For example, a small thing came. How do you kick-start the economy? Now, one of the greatest things known all over the world is
Real estate.
construction and housing, because it employs the largest amount of unskilled labor. Then the person who wants to get mortgage rate loan, he's supposed to take a loan at the beginning of his career, not toward the later half of the career. Your interest rates are incorrect for mortgage rates. Likewise, I'm sure if there are major reforms brought in these kind of sectors, likewise it goes around in tourism, I'm sure likewise it goes into a couple of sectors which are directly relating to job creations. If they are attended to, I think things will be different. But on the whole, I feel there is unnecessary pessimism. It is not correct. I'm a believer that there is a lot of optimism going on, and soon enough you will find investment coming in the economy. Thank you.
But I think, sir, you made a comment. I think Sajjan is going to ask a question also.
So thank you very much for your speech. I think today you have reassured all of us that country is on the right track, and we are looking forward to real growth in our country. Sir, as you rightly mentioned, that India is one of the bright spots in today's world economy, where India is probably one of the few countries which is growing at over 7%. And I also thank you for mentioning that steel industry, which needs some support when a huge amount of surge of imports is happening, especially when there is an economic war which is being driven by China to kill the Indian industries. In fact, today somebody was mentioning that this penicillin was being produced by 2 public sector undertakings, IDPL and Indian antibiotic companies. And China crashed the prices from $25 to $5, and the Indian public sector companies stopped manufacturing penicillin. Today we don't manufacture penicillin, which is the major input which goes in for making antibiotics. And tomorrow, if there is a war between India and China, China will probably stop supplying us penicillin. In the meantime, penicillin prices have moved up again from $5 to $35.
I think the point is very well made, that steel needs special consideration. And sir
Honorable
said,
Ministers mentioned.
KP Singh ji said on the, sir, may I request you to respond? We'll have to wrap up also.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, you're right when you say real estate can be a very important mover.
Multiplier.
It's a multiplier for more than one reason. Not only jobs, but the kind of raw material it consumes and so on. And the roadmap for the real estate sector in India is a very long and a key roadmap, because you need, as India grows over the next 10 to 20 years, you are going to have more urbanization, you'll have more suburbanization, you'll have more housing needed.
More
And
steel
therefore-
demand also.
And therefore, it leads to various forms of demand. Unfortunately, what had happened over several years was that it started with your uncontrolled inflation for various reasons. And when inflation touches 12%, you can't blame the central bank they have to take measures to contain inflations. The cost of capital became costlier. And then you had, probably still have, the most complicated system anywhere in the world for sanctioning real estate projects, which adds to costs. And then you have various real estate development companies which have invested in land banks, etc., also finding themselves squeezed in terms of capital.
So the real estate regulatory bill can happen?
Now, you see,
नहीं सर अभी तक कोशिश करनी है ना.
let's keep those possibilities outside. But what is reasonably possible? I think in the last 12 months, to bring down the repo rates down by 125 basis points, hopefully if the trend continues, that inflation remains under control, all these monies, which as a result of increased salaries and so on, real estate is one instrument by which they can come back into the system. And therefore the ability to spend is also going to increase.
Especially
so
that's going to
that's going to increase demand.
I think affordable housing, so you made
I also feel, and I have already taken up the issue with the Urban Development Ministry, of revisiting and advising the states on revisiting the sanctioning processes. They are a bit too long, both at the stage of sanction and at the stage of completion of the project. For example, you don't need an environmental clearance twice. Once for clearing the whole township and then once for clearing individual projects. Similarly, in order to ensure that there is compliance, you don't need to go to the municipality twice. Elsewhere in the world where real estate has come up in a big way, they've done it once. Now you can simplify those procedures. And therefore, once you have these kind of change environment, particularly with lower rates, etc., and that's the regime if we move into, it's a sector which is going to increase. The steel sector's problems are entirely different. The steel sector has suffered from a sudden surge over the last few years which has come in. The surge has come in from steel overseas, and preliminary inquiries have shown that it's being surged into India at less than cost because of surplus capacities, particularly in one jurisdiction. Now, twice we've already intervened. And on both occasions that we've intervened, now your industry has again represented to me and to the Commerce Ministry that after the last intervention in terms of safeguard duties, the prices have been further cut by those who are responsible for this surge. We are examining the matter again. Because the only regret is that these woes are being examined at a very late stage. Because like DISCOMs, the problems of the steel industry have now become problems of the banks. So we have to actually address the core issue of the steel industry so that the pressure on the banks itself can ease.
So that's very well said, sir. Very well said. So we must take on the competition, sir. But the 20% safeguard today is not enough. Would that be right, Sajjan? And so would it be right and fair to say that the biggest multiplier in our country, sir, is today roads, real estate, because that creates the, all the adjacent industry, all the multipliers, and we've been discussing that, sir, and fortunately all your team is deeply convinced, everybody's. Unfortunately, all actions have been taken.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. With that, we would want to conclude our today's program, but before the formal vote of thanks, may I request Shri Rana Kapoor to kindly present a small to the Honourable Minister as a token of gratitude and appreciation. Thank you very much.